You are listening to Novel Nest Audio. Episode 8, The Seer's First Divinations. In the previous episode, Klein awakened as a seer and discovered that the world hides unseen layers of spirituality, visible only to those who dare to look beyond ordinary sight. Above the gray fog, the strange gathering continued where knowledge was traded carefully and even a single revelation carried tremendous weight. But as new questions begin to surface, the path of a seer proves to be far more complicated than simple fortune-telling. Let us continue. Chapter 36. The Question That Changed the Discussion. Audrey carefully recalled a discussion she had once overheard between her father and her elder brother. The topic had been politics, specifically the way the kingdom's government constantly shifted with every election. Each time power changed hands, entire departments were reorganized and replaced. In their view, the constant reshuffling created chaos, weakened efficiency, and made life harder for ordinary citizens. Listening quietly, Klein understood the flaw immediately. The kingdom's political system had not yet developed a stable structure for selecting permanent administrators. Without such a system, every victorious party rewarded supporters with government positions, regardless of whether they were truly capable. The thought reminded him of the famous emperor from another nation. That legendary ruler had introduced many groundbreaking reforms during his reign. Yet, strangely, this particular idea had never been implemented in that empire. Before Klein could comment, Alger, the man known as the Hanged Man, let out a low, mocking chuckle. Alger speaks with dry sarcasm. So that's their realization. Sounds like they noticed the problem long after the bite. His metaphor referred to a venomous insect found in the southern regions of the kingdom. The creature's poison caused victims to itch so violently that they wanted to tear at their own skin. By the time the irritation began, the damage had already been done. Audrey covered her mouth lightly with her hand but chose not to respond to the sarcasm. Instead, she summarized the key point of the discussion she had overheard. Audrey explains calmly. They recognize the problem, but they haven't discovered a proper replacement for the current system. Klein listened carefully. The moment she finished speaking, he smiled faintly. From his perspective, the issue was actually quite simple. Klein speaks with quiet confidence. The issue you're describing is actually quite simple. Audrey blinked in surprise. Politics had never been a formal subject in her education, yet she had grown up surrounded by discussions of governance. She knew well that such matters were rarely simple. Klein remained composed. The conversation reminded him of debates he once read on forums in his previous life. Klein begins outlining an idea. Hold public examinations, similar to entrance tests for schools. Anyone qualified can participate. Divide the process into 2 or 3 stages so that the most capable candidates rise to the top. Audrey leaned forward slightly, intrigued but also uncertain where the suggestion was leading. Klein continued explaining. Those who pass the examinations can fill administrative posts throughout the government, cabinet offices, regional departments, and city administrations. Positions responsible for daily operations should be handled by people selected through this process. He continued refining the proposal as he spoke. Klein elaborates further. Different roles can have different requirements. Later stages of the exams could evaluate regional knowledge or specialized skills. Matters requiring expertise should always be handled by professionals. Then he clarified an important distinction. Klein adds a final condition. As for political leaders, ministers, governors, and mayors, those positions can still belong to whichever party wins the election. That share of authority is the reward for victory. Alger, who had shown little interest in the discussion at first, slowly turned his head and began listening carefully. Audrey furrowed her brows as she processed the idea. Klein wasn't finished yet. Klein continues outlining the system. You wouldn't replace everyone immediately. Doing so would cripple the government. Instead, hold public examinations regularly, perhaps once a year or every few years, and gradually fill positions as vacancies appear. In his mind, he was essentially describing a structured civil service. Klein concludes his proposal. This way, the kingdom gains a stable group of capable administrators. Regardless of which party controls the government, the state itself continues functioning efficiently. Of course, Klein knew such a system would eventually create a massive bureaucratic machine, but compared to the current chaos, it would still be a significant improvement. Audrey considered the proposal carefully before raising a cautious concern. Audrey asks hesitantly, "Are you suggesting that even if incompetent ministers took office, it wouldn't matter very much?" Before Klein could answer, Alger suddenly cut in. Alger responds with blunt humor. "In my opinion, even monkeys might do a better job than some ministers." He paused briefly before continuing. Alger adds another remark. "Monkeys would at least focus on eating, sleeping, and reproducing. They wouldn't dream up foolish projects that waste everyone's time." Klein couldn't help shaking his head slightly. The comment made it painfully obvious that Alger had little respect for his own superiors. Meanwhile, Audrey continued reflecting on Klein's idea. Gradually, realization dawned on her face. Audrey speaks with growing excitement. "The more I think about it, the more reasonable it sounds." Her eyes brightened. Audrey praises Klein sincerely. "Mr. Fool, you must be a very wise and experienced elder. Only someone with immense knowledge could come up with something so effective." Klein's lips twitched slightly at the compliment. He silently looked at the two members of the gathering before deciding to end the meeting. With quiet authority, he announced the end of the session. Klein announces the end of the gathering. "Let us conclude today's meeting here." Both participants immediately stood. Audrey and Alger respond respectfully. "As you wish." A moment later, Klein cut off the connection. The blurry figures of the two members shattered like illusions and dissolved into the endless gray fog. Once again, Klein sat alone in the vast, silent palace above the bronze table. He did not immediately leave the mysterious space this time. After becoming a beyonder, his mind had grown far more resilient. The strain of the ritual no longer exhausted him as quickly as before. The reason he had ended the meeting early was simple. Now that he understood the Nighthawk's real stance towards the Antigonus notebook, he knew he could no longer treat the matter casually. If he wanted to avoid attracting suspicion from Dunn Smith, he would need to search for the notebook carefully and methodically. Leaning back in his chair, Klein studied the endless gray fog surrounding him. The space felt ancient and untouched, as though no living being had entered it for Antigonus. While reflecting on the ritual he had performed earlier, Klein realized something unusual. Klein murmurs to himself, "Now that I'm a beyonder, I can sense another dark red star." This realization stirred his curiosity. Klein wonders quietly, "Does that mean I could summon another member?" But after a moment's thought, he dismissed the idea. Justice and the Hanged Man had been cooperative and discreet. There was no guarantee the next person would behave the same way. If he accidentally pulled someone like Dunn Smith into the gathering, the mysterious organization he had just created would immediately come under church surveillance. For the supposed leader of a secret organization, that would be a disastrous outcome. Klein knew the gray fog was extraordinary, yet he also had to consider a more frightening possibility: the existence of gods. He believed the 7 Orthodox deities likely existed, though perhaps not in the way people imagined. They might simply be powerful beings who had reached unimaginable levels. With a soft sigh, Klein decided not to summon anyone new for the time being. Klein speaks softly to himself. Forcing strangers into this place would be unfair. Better to wait. Standing up, he released his spirituality and began returning to his physical body. The gray fog vanished. Sensations rushed past him as if he were falling through layers of invisible water. Moments later, Klein opened his eyes in his darkened room.
This time he carefully observed the process. Klein mutters thoughtfully, "Strange, the grey fog isn't exactly the same as the spirit world." After pondering briefly, he walked to the window and pulled open the curtains. Sunlight flooded the room instantly. Outside, pedestrians moved along the street as if nothing unusual existed in the world. Klein took a deep breath. Klein speaks quietly to himself. Time to go to work. Another question soon followed. Klein wonders aloud, how exactly should I behave as a seer? For now, he only had one reliable ability, spirit vision. Far away in Empressborough, another member of the gathering was still overwhelmed with excitement. Audrey stood before a mirror in her bedroom. Her cheeks were flushed and her eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. Without wasting time, she grabbed a pen decorated with rubies and began writing quickly on a sheet of parchment. She carefully recorded the formula for the spectator potion. Audrey reads the ingredients softly as she writes. Pure water, autumn crocus essence, cow teeth pianol powder, elf flower petals, a manhalfish eyeball, and blackfish blood. After checking the list several times, she finally exhaled with relief. Then she began surrounding the formula with complicated chemical terms. To any casual observer, the page would appear to contain nothing more than confusing chemistry notes. Now she needed to gather the materials. Audrey thinks aloud. I'll search the family vaults first. If anything is missing, I can try exchanging items with others. If all else failed, she might have to seek help from the mysterious members of the gathering. Closing the notebook, she opened her bedroom door. A golden retriever sat patiently outside. Audrey praises the dog happily. Susie, you did a perfect job. Her smile widened with a new idea. Audrey laughs lightly. If detectives in stories have assistants, then a true spectator should have a big dog helping too. Elsewhere, in a dim underground room lit only by a flickering candle, Alger Wilson silently examined his palm. Despite all his preparation, he had discovered nothing about the mysterious ritual. Alger sighs quietly. It's still beyond my understanding. On the table before him lay a parchment inscribed with a short sentence in an ancient language. The words glimmered faintly in the candlelight. And somewhere far beyond ordinary perception, the grey fog remained silent, waiting for the next gathering.
Chapter 37. The Curious Stop at a Fortune-Telling Society. The afternoon sun burned brightly over the streets as Klein stepped out of his house. Instead of his usual formal attire, he dressed lightly, a linen shirt beneath a brown coat, a round felt hat, and worn leather shoes. The long walk ahead made heavy clothing impractical. More importantly, he didn't want sweat ruining his expensive suit. He walked down Daffodil Street toward Iron Cross Street. As he passed the nearby square, his eyes instinctively wandered to the open space where a circus had performed days earlier. The tents were gone. The entire troupe had already moved on to another town. Klein had once imagined the animal trainer who read his fortune might secretly be some mysterious expert. For a moment he even believed she had approached him deliberately after sensing something unusual about him. But reality proved otherwise. The circus had simply finished its show and continued its tour like any ordinary traveling troupe. So much for dramatic coincidences. Shaking his head at his own imagination, he continued walking toward Iron Cross Street. Iron Cross Street wasn't a single road. Two streets crossed one another at its center, dividing the area into four directions: Left Street, Right Street, Upper Street, and Lower Street. Klein, Benson, and Melissa had once lived in a small apartment on Lower Street. Yet the residents there rarely called it that. Instead, they preferred the more flattering name Middle Street. It created a small psychological distance between themselves and the far poorer district further down the road. 200 meters away, living conditions were far worse. In those cramped buildings, 5 or 6 people might share a single bedroom, sometimes even 10. As Klein walked along the edge of Left Street, his thoughts drifted back to the Antigonus family's notebook. The mysterious object had caused far more than inconvenience. It had led to death and become a serious concern for the Nighthawks. The more he thought about it, the heavier his chest felt. His expression slowly grew pale. Then a familiar voice called out, "Lad!" Klein turned toward the voice and realized he had stopped near the entrance of Smearin Bakery. Standing there was Mrs. Wendy Smearin, her gray hair tied neatly, as she waved at him with a gentle smile. "You don't look very cheerful today." Klein rubbed his face briefly. "Just a little troubled." Mrs. Wendy chuckled softly. "No matter how bad today feels, tomorrow will always arrive." She lifted a cup from the counter. "Here, try something new. I made sweet iced tea, but I'm not sure if people here will like it." Klein raised his eyebrow with a playful smile. "Aren't you a local too, Mrs. Smearin?" The elderly woman lifted her chin proudly. "I'm actually from the South. I came to Tingen with my husband more than 40 years ago. Back then, Benson hadn't even been born yet, and your parents hadn't met." Her eyes sparkled with memories. "I still miss the food from home. Sausages, potato bread, fried vegetables and lard, roasted meat with special sauces." She chuckled. "And sweet iced tea." Klein laughed softly. "You're making me hungry just hearing that. But I do feel better now. Thank you." Mrs. Wendy handed him the drink. "Give it a taste and tell me what you think." Klein took a sip. The flavor reminded him of iced tea from his previous world. It wasn't as sharp, but the tea's aroma was stronger and refreshing. The cold drink instantly pushed away the heat of the afternoon sun. "This is wonderful." Mrs. Wendy's eyes curved happily as she watched him finish the drink. After chatting briefly about his recent move, Klein left the bakery and continued along the street he knew best. In the afternoon hours, the street vendors had mostly disappeared. They would return after 5:30 when evening crowds gathered. Those who remained looked tired and half asleep under the lingering heat. The moment Klein stepped deeper into the neighborhood, something strange happened. A sudden heaviness spread through his chest, and inexorable gloom weighed on his heart. Klein immediately sensed something was wrong. He stopped walking and carefully examined his surroundings. Nothing unusual appeared at first glance. After a moment of thought, he raised his hand and gently tapped the center of his forehead. The world changed instantly. His spirit vision activated. The auras of nearby hawkers and pedestrians appeared before his eyes. But before he could study their health colors, something else seized his attention. Dark, emotional hues filled the area. He couldn't read their exact thoughts, yet he clearly felt the despair within them, apathy, exhaustion, and lingering sorrow. Even the bright sunlight above failed to wash away those colors. Klein understood. Years of poverty and hardship had stained the residents' emotions. The gloom wasn't temporary. It had been slowly carved into their lives over time. Old Neil's earlier warning echoed in his mind. Using spirit vision made it easier to step into unfamiliar spiritual environments. It also meant absorbing the emotional traces left behind by others. This was similar to another ability he gained after becoming a seer: perception. It was a passive awareness that allowed him to sense abnormalities automatically. But to sense something meant interacting with it. To those with spiritual sensitivity, abnormal presences shone like flames in the darkness. People with stronger perception inevitably felt the emotional pressure surrounding them. Klein sighed softly. No wonder the atmosphere feels so heavy. He tapped his forehead again and focused on controlling his spirituality. Then he continued walking. As he moved through the streets, he carefully sensed for anything unusual. At the same time, he searched for any hidden connection that might lead him to the missing Antigonus notebook. The streets looked ordinary. dirty water, scattered trash, and worn buildings. Only when he reached the apartment entrance did the surroundings become slightly cleaner. Klein pushed open the half-closed door and stepped inside. The sunlight barely reached the interior. He walked through the first floor slowly, listening to the faint creaks of the wooden staircase. The second floor remained as dark as he remembered. He extended his perception into the shadows, but he discovered nothing. There was no trace of the notebook. Not even a wandering spiritual body appeared. If supernatural things appeared so easily, ordinary people would have noticed them long ago. Most spirits didn't exist as visible entities anyway. They existed mainly as dispersed spirituality. Only specialists such as spirit mediums could communicate with them directly. After checking the third floor and finding nothing, Klein finally left the apartment. Then he followed the path in his memory towards Welch's residence. An hour passed as he walked. Still, he discovered nothing. Standing before Welch's gardened bungalow, Klein stared through the locked iron gate. There's probably no point searching here. The Nighthawks must have thoroughly investigated the place already. And besides, he didn't even have the key. They can't expect me to climb the walls. He decided to try another approach the next day. After such a long walk, he even joked to himself about the distance. I've walked so far today, and there isn't even a step counter ranking. He returned toward the nearby commercial district. His plan was to take a public carriage to Blackthorn Security Company and collect his daily allotment of ammunition. As a seer, he lacked direct combat abilities. For now, his revolver and cane were his only reliable weapons. The streets near Welch's neighborhood were noticeably cleaner. Elegant storefronts lined both sides of the road. As Klein approached a street corner, his eyes passed across several signs hanging on a building's second floor. One sign read, Harrod's Department Store. Another said, Military Veterans Mess. And another caught his attention, Divination Club. Klein repeated the name silently. The word reminded him of something important. He needed to practice acting like a seer. Perhaps visiting such a place could give him new ideas. With that thought, he crossed the street. Then he climbed the stairs to the second floor. Inside the entrance hall stood a beautiful female attendant. "Sir, would you like a fortune reading, or are you interested in joining the club?" Klein considered the question. What are the requirements for becoming a member? You simply fill in your personal details and pay a membership fee. The first year costs £5. After that, the annual fee drops to £1. Our club is not like political or business clubs. You don't need recommendations from existing members. Members are allowed to use the meeting rooms and divination tools freely. Tea and coffee are available. Newspapers and magazines can be read without charge. Meals and drinks are offered at cost price. Members can also purchase materials used for divination. And every month a famous fortune teller is invited to give lectures and answer questions. You'll meet many people who share the same interests. Klein listened carefully. The club sounded quite appealing. Unfortunately, one small problem remained. I can't afford it. Still smiling politely, he asked another question. Then how much would it cost if I only wanted my fortune told? And so the quiet question lingered in the air. A simple step inside a curious club, yet the path ahead was already beginning to unfold in ways Klein could not yet see.
Chapter 38. A beginner who treats divination as a hobby.
Klein's question hung in the air of the reception hall. The elegant attendant with brownish-yellow hair seemed slightly impatient for a brief moment, but she maintained a professional smile. The attendant explains the options. Members of the club are allowed to perform fortune-telling services here. Each of them sets their own price, and the club simply takes a small portion as a service fee. She then opened a thick album and placed it before Klein. The attendant continues explaining. If you only want your fortune told, you can browse through this booklet. It lists the members who are willing to perform readings along with their specialties and fees. She flipped through the pages. The attendant adds another detail. Since it's Monday afternoon, most members are still at work. Only 5 fortune tellers are present today. Klein was invited to sit on a sofa beside the window. The sunlight outside illuminated the quiet reception hall as the woman began introducing the available fortune tellers. The attendant introduces the first name. Hannes Vincent, a well-known fortune teller in Tingen. He serves as the club's mentor and is skilled in multiple forms of divination. His fee is 4 solely for a reading. Klein kept a neutral expression, but in his mind, the price made him click his tongue in disbelief. 4 solely could easily cover several hearty meals for him, Benson, and Melissa. Seeing his silence, the attendant continued flipping through the album. She finishes the introductions. And the last one is Glacius. He joined the club earlier this year. His specialty is tarot readings, and he charges 2 pence for a session. The woman looked up from the album. She asked Klein for his choice. Sir, which fortune teller would you like? Klein answered immediately. He replies simply, I'll go with Mr. Glacius. The attendant fell silent for a moment. She warns him gently. Sir, I should mention that Mr. Glacius is still considered a beginner. Klein smiled calmly. He responded without hesitation. That's fine. I'll accept the outcome of my own decision. The attendant nodded and led him away from the reception area. A short hallway stretched ahead. At the end of it was a meeting room filled with sunlight. Inside were tables, chairs, newspapers, magazines, and scattered cards. The faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee drifted through the air. A few doors stood along the corridor beside the meeting room. The attendant gestures for Klein to wait. She stepped into the meeting room and raised her voice slightly. She called out, Mr. Glacius, someone is here for a reading. A startled male voice immediately answered from inside. Glacius responded with surprise. Me? A chair scraped against the floor. The attendant asked another question. Which divination room would you prefer? The man answered almost immediately. Glacius chose a room. The topaz room. I've always liked topaz. Moments later, Glacius appeared in the doorway. He looked to be in his 30s. His skin carried a slightly darker tone, and his dark green eyes studied Klein with curiosity. His pale yellow hair fell softly around his face. He wore a white shirt beneath a black vest, and a monocle hung from a chain across his chest. The man carried himself with relaxed elegance. Without another word, the attendant opened the nearby door labeled Topaz Room. Inside, thick curtains blocked most of the daylight. The dimness created an atmosphere many fortune tellers believed necessary for receiving spiritual guidance. Glacius stepped inside and bowed slightly. Glacius introduces himself. Hello, I'm Glacius. I honestly didn't expect anyone to choose me today. He walked to the table and sat down. Glacius spoke candidly. To be honest, I'm still learning how to read for other people. My experience is limited. He paused for a moment. Glacius gives Klein an option. If you'd like, you can still change your mind. Klein returned the bow and entered the room. He answered calmly, You're very honest, but once I make a decision, I rarely change it. Glacius gestured toward the chair across the table. Before beginning, he spoke about his personal view of divination. Glacius explains his perspective. Divination is more of a hobby for me. I believe that divine guidance exists in everyday life, but ordinary people often fail to interpret it correctly. That belief was precisely why he joined the club. Still, he admitted that he lacked confidence in his abilities. Glacius proposes an idea. Let's treat today's reading as an exchange of experiences instead of a business transaction. I'll cover the club's small fee myself. Klein did not immediately respond. Instead, he leaned forward slightly and tapped his forehead twice. Glacius watched him with curiosity. He asks casually, Does your head hurt? Are you hoping to divine something about your health?
Klein slowly leaned back in his chair. He explains his purpose. Not exactly. I'm trying to locate a missing item. While speaking, Klein quietly examined Glacis through spirit vision. The man's aura appeared clearly. The orange glow around Glacis's lungs looked unusually dim and scattered. Klein recognized that the pattern did not resemble simple fatigue. Glacis considered the request briefly. He suggests a simple method. Since you're searching for a lost object, we'll begin with a straightforward tarot determination. He pushed a neatly stacked deck of tarot cards across the black table. Glacis explains the process. Calm your mind and focus on the missing object. Ask yourself a single question, whether the item can still be found. Klein needed to shuffle the cards while repeating the question internally. Glacis finishes the instructions. After shuffling and cutting the deck, draw one card. Klein followed the instructions carefully. He didn't even know what the missing notebook truly looked like, so he simply repeated the same question again and again in his mind. After shuffling the cards, he cut the deck. Glacis selected the top card and placed it horizontally on the table. Glacis explains the interpretation. Rotate the card until it stands vertically, then flip it over. If the image appeared inverted, it would mean the object could not be found. If upright, they could continue searching for the location. Klein rotated the card. Then he flipped it over. The card was inverted. Glacis sighs softly. That's unfortunate. Klein barely heard the comment. His attention was locked onto the card itself. The image on the card showed a figure dressed in elaborate robes and an ornate crown. It was the Fool. The same symbol had appeared before. Klein knew tarot cards were merely tools. True divination relied on spirituality and the spirit world. Still, the coincidence felt unsettling. Klein asked another question. He asks calmly, "Can we determine whether someone else has already taken the item?" Glacis nodded with interest. He encourages Klein. "Of course, repeat the same process." Klein shuffled and cut the cards once more. He drew another card and positioned it horizontally. While turning it, Klein silently hoped for one thing, anything but the Fool. He flipped the card. The image showed the Star. The card was inverted. Glacis explains the result. That means the item hasn't been taken by anyone else yet. Klein nodded. He tapped his forehead again thoughtfully before taking out 2 pennies. He slid them across the table. Glacis protests lightly. "I thought we agreed this would be free." Klein stood up. He explains with a smile. "Divination deserves proper respect." Glacis accepted the coins and stood up to shake hands. Just as Klein reached the door, he stopped. He turns back and speaks briefly. "Mr. Glacis, I recommend seeing a doctor soon." Glacis blinked in surprise. He asks, "Why would you say that?" Klein considered his words. He answers carefully. "The color of your face suggests a problem. The area between your eyebrows looks unusually dark." Glacis had never heard such a diagnosis. Klein simply smiled and left the room. The door closed softly behind him. Inside the dim room, Glacis adjusted his monocle and laughed quietly. He mutters to himself, "Is he a doctor, or perhaps some herbal healer?" Looking closely at the mirror, he noticed something interesting. His forehead did appear dark, but only because the curtains had blocked most of the light. In fact, the entire room was dark. Glacis shook his head. He sighs lightly. That's not a very pleasant joke. Still, he decided to perform a divination about his health just to be certain. Meanwhile, after leaving the club, Klein began forming a new plan. He would save enough money to become a member of the Divination Club. That would allow him to properly practice acting as a seer. Setting up on the street as a fortune-telling hawker would damage his reputation. Soon afterward, a public carriage arrived. For 2 pence, Klein rode to Zodlin Street. He pushed open the door of Blackthorn Security Company. The familiar brown-haired receptionist was absent. Instead, Leonard Mitchell stood behind the counter, his green eyes calm and thoughtful. Klein removed his hat. He greeted Leonard. "Good afternoon. Where's Roseanne?" Leonard pointed towards the armory. He answered calmly, "She's working the night shift today." Then Leonard looked at Klein thoughtfully. He speaks slowly. "There's something I've always wondered about." Klein tilted his head. He asks, "What is it?" Leonard stood up and walked around the counter. He asks the question, "If Welch and Naya died immediately, why were you able to walk away?" Klein repeated the official explanation. "It likely happened because I was forced to hide the notebook first." Leonard paced slowly. Then he stopped and looked directly into Klein's eyes. He asks another question. "If the goal was to silence witnesses, why didn't that force make you destroy the notebook immediately?" The question lingered in the quiet office. A simple doubt, yet one that quietly pressed against the fragile truth surrounding the past.
Chapter 39. A Curious Method. Leonard Mitchell's question lingered in the quiet office. Klein paused for a moment, his thoughts racing as he searched for an explanation that sounded believable. He knew the truth was far more complicated than anything he could safely say. Still, after years of consuming detective novels and supernatural dramas, his mind quickly began assembling a theory. Klein answers slowly. "Perhaps when Welch, Naya, and I came into contact with that unknown entity, it found the deaths entertaining." He continued constructing the theory as he spoke. Klein elaborates on the idea. "If those suicides were meant to be discovered, then forcing me to hide the notebook might have been part of a larger plan. Maybe the entity intended to repeat the ritual later." Klein exhaled softly. He finishes his explanation. "But something must have gone wrong in the middle of the process, and my suicide didn't succeed." In reality, Klein knew exactly what had disrupted that fatal chain of events. The interruption had come from a factor no one in this world could possibly anticipate: a transmigrated soul. Leonard listened carefully. He responded thoughtfully. "That explanation is reasonable, but there could be other possibilities." He leaned slightly against the counter as he continued. Leonard proposes another idea. "What if the deaths of Welch and Naya served as sacrifices?" The thought hung heavily in the air. Leonard continues explaining. "Those sacrifices might have allowed that unknown being to descend into our world." Then he pointed toward the notebook. Leonard adds another theory. "In that case, the notebook might be a container or even a breeding ground for something evil." His eyes locked onto Klein's. Leonard finishes calmly. "Perhaps you were forced to hide it so we wouldn't destroy it before whatever was inside could grow stronger." Klein's thoughts froze for a split second. Was Leonard testing him? The idea of his body being used as some kind of vessel briefly flashed across his mind. If anything had occupied that body, it was simply another soul from a different world. Klein chose his words carefully. He answers calmly. "I can't really defend myself. My memories from that time are incomplete." He continued with a neutral expression. "The captain and Madame Daly have already examined me and confirmed that I'm fine." Then he added one more sentence. Klein remarked quietly, "Your joke isn't very amusing." Leonard laughed softly. He responded casually, "I'm just exploring possibilities." Then his expression softened. Leonard adds calmly, "In any case, we trust the goddess will ultimately protect us." The tension faded slightly. Leonard asks another question. "Did you find anything during your search this afternoon?" Klein had already become wary of Leonard. He answered simply, "No, I'll try another direction tomorrow." He pointed toward the partition leading deeper into the building. Klein adds, "I'm heading to the armory to collect my bullets." Leonard placed a hand over his chest. He gives a blessing. May the goddess watch over you. Klein walked past the partition and descended the stairs. Behind him, Leonard's smile slowly faded. A hint of doubt appeared in his green eyes.
Downstairs, gas lamps lit the corridor leading to the armory and archives. The iron door stood open. Roseanne was standing beside the table, chatting with a middle-aged man wearing a top hat and a thick beard. The moment she noticed Klein, Roseanne turned toward him eagerly. Roseanne greets him with excitement. "Good afternoon," or maybe "good evening." It always feels like night down here. Her questions followed one after another. Roseanne asks eagerly, "I heard from old Neil that you've become a Beyonder. Is it true that your potion is called Seer?" Klein nodded. He answered politely, "Yes, though to be precise, the potion itself carries that name." Roseanne sighed softly. She responded thoughtfully, "So you really chose that path?" Klein then looked toward the bearded man beside her. He asked politely, "And you are?" Roseanne answered immediately. She introduces the man. "This is Brett. He's one of our colleagues." She continued explaining. Roseanne adds enthusiastically, "He wants to swap shifts with me because he plans to take his wife to the theater for their 15th wedding anniversary." Brett extended his hand. He greets Klein. "Nice to meet you. I heard you became a Beyonder rather quickly." He chuckled softly. Brett adds honestly, "I don't think I'd ever have the courage to make that choice." Klein shook his hand. He jokes lightly, "Maybe it's because I didn't understand the dangers well enough." Brett shook his head slowly. He explains seriously, "A Beyonder once told me something before he died." His expression grew serious. Brett continues, "The less you know about strange things, the longer you live." Roseanne suddenly changed the subject. She asked Klein, "Why are you dressed like that today, and what do you need from the armory?" Klein answered simply. He explains, "I came to collect my 30 bullets." Soon afterward, Klein left the armory with his ammunition. He walked toward the shooting club. The sharp sound of gunfire echoed repeatedly. Raise the gun, aim, fire, unload the empty shells, reload. Again and again he practiced until the motions became instinctual. Afterward he exercised, push-ups, stretches, and strength training. By the time he finished, darkness had already settled across the city. When Klein returned home, he found Melissa carrying a bag filled with school supplies and groceries. She calmly explained that she had taken some money earlier to buy food. Klein asked why she continued walking to school instead of taking the carriage. Melissa immediately began calculating the daily transportation costs. Before she could continue her lengthy explanation, Klein quickly stopped her. He patiently explained that their finances were stable enough. Saving time and energy would allow her to focus on studying. After a long debate, Melissa finally agreed. The following day arrived quickly. After ensuring Melissa took the carriage to school, Klein headed for the company. Inside the office, old Neil and Roseanne were chatting near the reception desk. Klein tipped his hat politely. He greets them. "Good morning." Old Neil gave him a playful look. He asks teasingly, "Didn't you overhear anything strange last night, did you?" Klein shook his head. He answered calmly, "No, I slept perfectly well." Old Neil laughed. He gestured toward the stairs. "Good. Come to the armory. We'll continue your mysticism lessons today." Klein followed him downstairs. As they entered the armory, he finally asked the question on his mind. Klein asks, "What will we be studying today?" Old Neil dragged out the moment before answering. He responded slowly, "First, we'll review the foundations of mysticism." Then he raised his wrist. Old Neil adds, "But before that, let me show you a very interesting trick." The silver chain on his wrist swayed gently, and at its end, a moonstone glimmered softly in the dim light. A small demonstration was about to begin. Chapter 40. Lessons from the Mysticism Classroom. Klein's interest was immediately piqued when old Neil mentioned an interesting trick. He leaned slightly forward, eager to know what kind of demonstration awaited him. Klein asks curiously, "What kind of trick are you talking about?" Old Neil chuckled instead of answering directly. "I'll finish checking the armory, the storeroom, and the archives first. While I'm gone, prepare 2 cups of coffee, using the cups on the table." Then he added a strange request. "In the 1 cup, put something unpleasant. What exactly it is, that's up to you." He lifted a finger. "Just don't waste my coffee powder. Those beans come from the Finapotter Plateau, and I ground them myself." Although he had no idea what the old man was planning, Klein nodded without hesitation. "All right." Klein watched old Neil unlock the armory with a copper key before disappearing inside. The echoes of footsteps faded in the distance. Turning back to the table, Klein checked the kettle and confirmed that the water was still hot. He opened a silver tin container filled with freshly ground coffee. Using a small metal spoon, he placed 1 scoop of the aromatic powder into each cup. Then he poured hot water into both cups and stirred them slowly. Coffee wasn't unfamiliar to Klein. However, in his previous world, he had mostly drunk instant coffee rather than freshly brewed grounds like these. After finishing the preparation, he paused and began thinking about the unpleasant ingredient. Finally, he bent down and scraped a bit of dried mud from the bottom of his leather boot. He dropped the dirt into the left cup. Then he stirred the coffee until both cups looked and smelled nearly identical. Several minutes later, old Neil emerged from the armory. The iron gate slammed shut behind him with a heavy clang. "Finished already?" Klein nodded. "Yes." Old Neil removed the silver chain from his wrist and sat down. His expression grew calm and focused. He held the chain so the moonstone at its end dangled over the cup on his right. For a moment, the pendulum hung completely still. Then it began to tremble. The chain slowly rotated in a counterclockwise circle. "This is the cup with the unpleasant ingredient." Without waiting for confirmation, he set the pendulum aside and lifted the other cup. He took a sip. "Do you prefer your coffee bitter? Personally, I add both sugar and milk." Klein's curiosity was now fully awakened. He asked eagerly, "That was remarkably accurate. Is it because of the stone on the chain?" Old Neil placed the cup back on the table. He begins teaching. "This technique is known as pendulum divination, sometimes called spirit dowsing." He explained that the method relied on a connection between a person's astral projection and the spiritual world. Natural materials such as crystals, gemstones, or special metals were often used as the pendulum's weight. The motion of the pendulum carried meaning. Old Neil clarifies. A counterclockwise movement signals a negative. Clockwise means positive. If the pendulum doesn't move at all, the result is neutral. Klein considered the explanation carefully. He asks another question. "So if we want an answer, we should phrase the statement as a question?" Old Neil shook his head. "No, it must be written as a statement. Instead of writing something like a question about whether a person wished to marry you, the statement should directly claim that the person wished to do so. The sentence would be written on paper. Then the pendulum would be held over it." Old Neil continued explaining the technique step by step. The pendulum must be held in the dominant hand. The arm should remain straight. The moonstone should hang just above the written statement. Then the practitioner closes their eyes and repeats the sentence silently 7 times. When the eyes reopen, the pendulum's movement reveals the answer. Klein slowly absorbed everything old Neil had explained. The pendulum's motion could indicate success or failure. He quickly recognized how useful the technique could be. In an unfamiliar place, the method could determine whether food or drink might be poisoned. However, old Neil also pointed out its weakness. The technique could only provide simple answers. It couldn't analyze complicated situations or interpret layered meanings.
Klein sighed softly. He speaks thoughtfully. I should save money to buy a crystal or a silver chain to make a pendulum. Old Neil looked at him in confusion. He responds, Why buy one? You can simply apply for it. He explained that pendulums were standard equipment for beyonders who served support roles. The armory even had one made from topaz and pure silver. Klein felt excited but slightly unsure. He answers cautiously. But I'm not a full member yet. Old Neil laughed. He explains. Beyonders may not receive higher pay, but they are given certain benefits. With that settled, Old Neil began the day's formal lesson. He asked Klein a question. Do you understand what symbolism means in mysticism? Klein paused before answering. He explains carefully. The spiritual world and the unknown realms exist beyond ordinary human senses. Because they cannot be described directly, their truths appear through abstract symbols. These symbols act as representations for deeper meanings. Old Neil nodded with satisfaction. He praised Klein. That's a very accurate explanation. He explained that tarot images and their various elements were examples of symbolic language. Old Neil then began sketching shapes on paper. The first drawing resembled a curved line with several vertical strokes beneath it. He asks Klein, What do you think this symbol represents? Klein studied it carefully. He answers uncertainly. Eyelashes? Old Neil sighed. He clarified the symbols. Old Neil explains. That represents the bumper harvest constellation. He then drew several other symbols representing additional constellations. As Klein memorized them, he couldn't help commenting on their names. Klein remarks humorously. These constellation names sound rather primitive. Old Neil smiled at the remark. He explains. Emperor Roselle once wanted to rename them with more refined titles. However, tradition proved too powerful to change. Old Neil spent the rest of the morning explaining fundamental mysticism concepts. He taught the symbols of celestial bodies, the sun, the crimson moon, several different stars. He also showed Klein how to draw an astrolabe used for divination. There were also instructions on choosing incantations and crafting crystal balls. Eventually, Old Neil glanced at his pocket watch. He announces, That's enough for today. He reminded Klein to review the historical records prepared earlier. Some of those documents even frightened Old Neil himself. Before leaving, Klein mentioned his plan to join a divination club. Practicing readings for others would help him master the abilities of a seer. Old Neil didn't object. Instead, he told Klein the expenses could be approved by the captain. Such clubs might secretly contain cultists. Monitoring them would actually help the Nighthawks. Klein was momentarily speechless. Then he quickly agreed. He answers firmly. I'll report the matter to the captain. Old Neil glanced toward the cup containing the unpleasant ingredient. He asked casually, So, what exactly did you put in that coffee? Klein scratched his head awkwardly. He answers honestly. Just some mud from the bottom of my boot. Old Neil throws. Then he covered his mouth and burst angrily. Old Neil yells, Why haven't you thrown it away yet? And in the quiet armory, the smell of coffee still lingered. One cup carried the bitter scent of roasted beans. The other held something far less pleasant.
Some answers arrive quietly, long before anyone realizes their meaning. And sometimes the smallest lesson opens the door to far deeper mysteries. We'll continue this journey in the next episode.
This episode is an original retelling inspired by a popular web novel.